Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're taking a deep dive into natural ways to lower blood pressure.
Interesting.
We're drawing on an episode of the Health Matters podcast, and it's packed with great information. So whether you're concerned about hypertension or just want to stay ahead of the game, this one's for you.
Definitely. High blood pressure is a big deal, and it's often called the silent killer. You might not even know you have it. There aren't always clear symptoms.
Oh, wow. It's kind of sneaky. But why is it such a big deal? What makes it so dangerous?
Well, the thing is, high blood pressure puts a lot of force on your artery walls. And over time, that constant strain can really damage your cardiovascular system.
Okay, so even if you don't feel it, it's doing damage behind the scenes.
Exactly. And that damage can lead to some serious health problems like heart disease and stroke.
I see. So it's definitely something you want to get a handle on.
Absolutely.
So let's dive into the good stuff. What are some of the natural ways to address high blood pressure that they talk about in this podcast episode?
Well, they start with one of the fundamentals, which is diet.
Right, what you eat. Makes sense.
And specifically, they emphasize reducing sodium intake.
Okay, cutting back on salt. That's something I've heard before, but I'm always curious to learn more about the how and why. So how does sodium actually affect blood pressure? Like, what's the mechanism there?
Think of it this way. When you eat too much sodium, your body tends to hold on to more water.
Interesting. So it's about fluid retention.
Right. And this extra fluid in your system increases your blood volume, which in turn puts more pressure on your blood vessel walls. It's like trying to squeeze the same amount of water through a narrower pipe. The pressure goes up.
That's a great analogy. So by cutting back on sodium, we're basically helping our bodies maintain a healthy fluid balance, which helps reduce that pressure.
Exactly. And the podcast episode specifically calls out processed foods as major sodium culprits.
Makes sense. They're often loaded with sodium.
Yeah. They recommend focusing on fresh fruits, vegetables, and whole grains instead. More natural whole foods.
Got it. Now, they also mentioned the DHH diet. I've heard that name before, but I'm not entirely sure what it is. What's the deal with the DH diet?
DHH stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. It's basically a science-backed eating plan that's designed to lower blood pressure.
So it's not just some fad diet. There's actual research behind it.
Oh, yeah. Tons of research. The DH diet is all about choosing foods that are naturally rich in potassium, magnesium, and calcium, which can help regulate blood pressure.
So it's kind of like a multi-pronged approach.
Right. It also limits saturated fat and cholesterol, which is good for overall heart health.
That makes sense. So it's kind of like a win-win. You're lowering your blood pressure and improving your heart health at the same time.
Exactly. And the best part is it's not about deprivation. It's really about making sustainable, healthy choices that you can stick with long term.
I love that. It's about building healthy habits rather than just going on a crash diet.
Exactly. Sustainability is key.
Okay, so we've talked about diet, but what about exercise? I've always wondered about the specifics when it comes to exercise and blood pressure.
Well, they jump right into that after diet. They say you should aim for at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic activity per week.
Okay, so that gives us a target to shoot for. But what exactly do those intensities mean, practically speaking?
Good question. Moderate intensity would be something like brisk walking, where you can talk but you're breathing harder than usual. And vigorous intensity would be more like running or swimming laps, where you can only say a few words at a time.
So it's not just about moving, it's about getting your heart rate up to a certain level.
Exactly. And they recommend spreading those minutes out over the week, so you don't have to cram it all in at once.
That makes it much more manageable.
Yeah.
I know people can get overwhelmed by the thought of having to block out huge chunks of time for exercise.
Right. And even if you can't hit those recommendations right away, the key is to start small and gradually increase your activity level over time.
I love that approach. It's all about building those healthy habits, step by step.
Absolutely. Consistency is key.
Speaking of things that can have a big impact over time, I think it's time we address another crucial piece of the blood pressure puzzle. Stress. It's true, stress can really take a toll on your health.
Oh, absolutely. Chronic stress can wreak havoc on your body in so many ways, and blood pressure is definitely no exception.
I can see how constantly being in that fight or flight mode could lead to elevated blood pressure. But I've always been curious about the actual physiological connection there. How does stress physically impact those numbers?
Well, when you're stressed, your body releases a surge of hormones like adrenaline and cortisol.
Right, those stress hormones, we've all heard of them.
And these hormones, they basically trigger a cascade of physiological changes that are designed to help you deal with the perceived threat.
So it's like your body's preparing you to either fight or flee.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your heart rate increases, your breathing becomes more rapid, your blood vessels constrict. It's all about getting you ready for action.
Wow. It's amazing how our bodies can just shift gears like that.
It's pretty incredible. It's an evolutionary response that has helped us survive for millennia. But the problem is that in today's world, we're often faced with chronic stress, which means our bodies are essentially stuck in this heightened state of alert.
And that can't be good for your blood pressure.
Definitely not. When your body is constantly pumping out those stress hormones, it puts a lot of strain on your cardiovascular system. And one of the consequences is that your blood pressure remains elevated for longer periods of time.
So it's like your body's in a constant state of red alert.
Exactly. And that's why finding healthy ways to manage stress is so essential for keeping your blood pressure in check.
That makes perfect sense. So what are some of the stress-busting techniques that they recommend in the podcast episode?
They talk a lot about the importance of incorporating relaxation techniques into your daily routine.
Okay, like what kinds of things?
Things like meditation, deep breathing exercises, yoga, those sorts of things. They've been shown to be really effective in activating your body's relaxation response, which helps counteract those stress hormones we were talking about.
I've heard that deep breathing can be really powerful. Even just taking a few minutes to really focus on your breath can make a difference.
It really can. It's a simple but incredibly effective technique for calming your nervous system and shifting out of that fight or flight mode.
I'll have to try that. Are there any other stress management strategies that they highlight?
They also emphasize the importance of making time for activities that you genuinely enjoy that help you unwind and de-stress.
So finding things that bring you joy.
Exactly. Whether it's spending time in nature, listening to music, reading a good book, or pursuing a creative hobby, those moments of joy and relaxation can make a world of difference in reducing stress levels.
I love that. It's all about finding what works for you and making time for the things that nourish your soul.
Absolutely. Self-care is so important. And speaking of self-care, we can't forget about another crucial factor that they mention: sleep.
Ah, yes, sleep, the foundation of good health. But how does sleep specifically relate to blood pressure?
Well, it turns out that when you don't get enough sleep, your body produces more of those stress hormones we were talking about, adrenaline and cortisol.
So even if I'm managing stress during the day, if I'm not getting enough sleep at night, my blood pressure could still be affected.
That's right. It's all connected. They emphasize that when you sleep, your body has a chance to truly rest and repair, and that includes giving your cardiovascular system a break.
It makes you realize how important it is to make sleep a priority.
It really does. They recommend aiming for 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep each night for optimal blood pressure regulation.
So even if you're doing everything right during the day, managing stress, eating well, getting exercise, if you skimp on sleep, your blood pressure could still take a hit.
That's the takeaway. Sleep is crucial for giving your body a chance to recover. It's like hitting the reset button for your cardiovascular system.
Makes sense. So it sounds like we need to make sleep a non-negotiable part of our routine.
Absolutely. Prioritizing sleep is one of the best things you can do for your overall health, including your blood pressure.
Okay, so we've covered diet, exercise, stress management, and sleep, all incredibly important. But I think there are a couple more lifestyle factors that were mentioned in the podcast that we haven't touched on yet.
Right. There are a couple of biggies we should definitely talk about.
Okay, lay them on me.
All right. First up, no surprise here. Quitting smoking.
Of course, smoking is bad news all around, but I'm curious about the specifics when it comes to blood pressure. What's the connection there?
Smoking damages your blood vessels, plain and simple. It makes them less flexible and more prone to hardening.
Okay, so it's like a 1-2 punch.
Yeah.
You're already dealing with the force of blood against your artery walls, and then smoking comes along and makes those walls even more rigid.
Exactly. It's a recipe for high blood pressure.
Makes sense. So smoking is a definite no-go if you're trying to manage your blood pressure.
Mm-hmm.
What about alcohol? Where does that fit in?
The podcast emphasizes moderation when it comes to alcohol. They actually give some specific guidelines.
Oh, that's helpful. What do they recommend?
For women, they suggest sticking to 1 drink per day, and for men, no more than 2.
So not a total ban, but definitely something to be mindful of.
Exactly. It's about finding that healthy balance.
Now, before we wrap up, I'm curious if they mentioned any other lifestyle factors that can affect blood pressure. Anything surprising?
Actually, yes. They highlighted the power of social connection.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that. How does social connection relate to blood pressure?
Well, they explain that having strong social connections, nurturing relationships with loved ones, and feeling a sense of belonging can actually help lower blood pressure.
That's amazing. I know spending time with friends and family is good for my mental health, but to think it could be benefiting my physical health too.
It really highlights how interconnected our minds and bodies are. It's likely that positive social interactions help buffer stress, which we know plays a big role in blood pressure regulation.
Wow, I'm really struck by that. Makes you think about the importance of those connections.
It really does.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. This Health Matters podcast episode was a treasure trove of information.
It was. So many great tips.
Let's do a quick recap for our listeners just to make sure everything sinks in. We started with diet, talking about reducing sodium and exploring the DAS diet.
Right, which focuses on those heart-healthy foods.
Then we moved on to exercise, aiming for that 150 minutes of moderate activity or 75 minutes of vigorous activity each week.
And of course, starting small and being consistent.
Exactly. Then we dove into the world of stress management, talking about meditation, deep breathing, and finding activities that help us unwind.
And getting enough sleep. 7 to 9 hours a night. Can't forget that one.
Absolutely. And then we wrap things up with those big picture lifestyle changes. Quitting smoking, moderating alcohol intake, and nurturing those social connections.
It's a holistic approach to managing blood pressure naturally, addressing all those different aspects of your life.
Well said. Now, before we say goodbye, I think it's super important to emphasize that while these natural methods can be really effective, it's crucial to work with your doctor, especially if you're already on medication for high blood pressure.
Couldn't agree more. Never stop taking prescribed medications without talking to your doctor first.
Absolutely. They're your partner in health. Now, to wrap up this episode, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question based on something we talked about today. If strong social connections can help lower blood pressure, could it be that weak or strained relationships might actually contribute to higher blood pressure? What do you think?
That's a great question. It really makes you think about the power of our connections and their impact on our health.
Definitely something to ponder. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dives. A huge thank you to the Health Matters podcast for the insightful source material, and thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this journey. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating deep dive.